The following recorded Sunday School Bible lesson by President Jimmy Carter was taught at Marantha Baptist Church in Plains, Georgia, on the date shown on the tape. The lesson is based on the Uniform Bible Study Series published and copyrighted by Smith & Hellis Publishing Incorporated of Macon, Georgia. Additional information about the class, the lesson materials, and your possible attendance at one of the class sessions will be given at the end of the lesson.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning, everybody. I got wet. It's really raining outside. We have any visitors this morning? Okay, that looks like a lot of happy visitors. Be inside. If you're here for the first time, I'd like to know where you're from. We'll start off on this over here. Just what state or what country? Tennessee, okay. Everybody? Maine? Alabama? Okay, that's the front row. Indiana? Louisiana. Any others over here? Florida. Any new ones that haven't been called out yet? Yes? Colorado? Good deal. Where? Canada, okay. Ohio. And Vermont. Nebraska? And Georgia, okay, very nice. I was wondering. Any new ones in the middle that hadn't been called out yet? Well, if you can't remember, you can call it out twice. Yes?
California.
California, okay. Mississippi. India? Welcome. Illinois. Michigan? New York. Texas and South Africa? Welcome. Any others in the middle? Okay. And on the other side over here, any new ones? Different ones? Yes? You raise your hand. Okay. Very good. We have any pastors here? Missionaries, active or retired? Missionaries, active or retired, or pastors? None over here? Okay, it's hard to see. No, nothing? No pastors? Okay, I was going to get over there. I'll start on your right-hand side. What denomination, where were you serving?
Seventh-day Adventist Church, and serving as an administrator at Southern Adventist University in Tennessee.
Welcome. Glad to have you. Any others? Okay. Yes?
Retired United Baptist minister, also working with the Nomads.
With whom?
Nomads.
Where?
We're on our way to Florida right now. Last year we worked in Mississippi, so we're working in Canada.
Welcome. Any others? Okay. Would you mind leading us in prayer this morning? Everyone, bow your heads, please.
Our gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you so much that you've brought us here this morning. We have come here to hear your word and to worship, and I pray that you will open our ears and open our hearts so that we may be changed by the message that we have to hear this morning. We thank you so much for President Carter and everything that he has done for our entire world and the change that he's brought to it. I pray that you will continue to give him strength and that you will use him as your spokesperson this morning. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
You all ordinarily worship on Saturdays?
Yes.
And your churches just convene on Saturdays,
Yes.
right? Well, good luck to you. It's nice to have you with us this morning. Well, Rosa and I have been busy this year mostly, but last couple of weeks. Week before last, we spent in Washington a good bit. We went up and both of us had long sessions with the Obamas, telling them what to do when they get in the White House. On, I think, Tuesday night, I met with him for about an hour or so and talked to him primarily about the work of the Carter Center. And he was particularly interested in the Middle East because I've been over there twice in recent months. And I met with all the factions in the Middle East that are going to be involved eventually in a ceasefire, including Hamas and leaders who now live in both Gaza and in Damascus, Syria, and met with the president of Syria and the leaders, all the leaders of Lebanon. They're going to have an election on the 7th of June, and we expect to be over there monitoring that election. Obviously, the Israelis and Fatah and the Egyptians as well. So he was interested in my recent travels. And we had a good time with him. And then the next day at noon, as you may have noticed, we met with all the presidents. Obama suggested to George Bush that he invite us, and we all met there in the White House. It was a very pleasant lunch, a little bit strained because everybody had to be careful not to criticize what President Bush has done the last 8 years. So, as you can see, that didn't leave us much to talk about. But it was very helpful, I think. Obama had some questions. Bill Clinton did most of the talking. But George H.W. Bush was there, as well as I and the others. And we talked about how to deal with the Vice President's staff to make sure there's no disagreements between the people that work under the Vice President and the ones that work under the President. I was the first president who ever moved the Vice President into the White House. In the past, the President had required the Vice President to be in a completely different building, and they hardly had any relationship. But Fritz Mondale, who was my Vice President, moved in, had an office right next to mine. And our staffs were just like one staff. We didn't divide up, line ourselves like baseball teams fighting each other. We cooperated. And there was a lot of questions about Obama's children. He had, his oldest daughter is the same age that Amy was when we moved into the White House. So we even talked about that. And while we were meeting in the White House, Rosa was meeting with Mrs. Obama. And they spent quite a while, about an hour and a half, talking about things that women talk about that I don't want men to know. But that was a fairly pleasant thing. And then we came back and we went to China. And we didn't have last Sunday. We went to bed Saturday night and woke up Monday morning. There was no Sunday on the way. As you go westward, as you know, you cross the international date line and you lose a day. And then when we came back, we had 2 Fridays, so but we swapped a Sunday for a Friday. And I was over there because 30 years ago this month, I normalized diplomatic relations with China. And I had been to China 60 years ago this year, in 1949. I was a young submarine officer, and it was the last few days of the nationalist Chinese under Chiang Kai-shek controlling just a few seaports. So my submarine went into Hong Kong and up to Shanghai, and then went up and spent 2 or 3 weeks in Tsingtao, which is now Qingdao, in the northern part of China. And while we were there, the Mao Zedong's Communist Party had taken all the mainland, and we could see their campfires around on the hills as our submarine went in. And we always tied up our submarine heading out to sea, so all I had to do is crank up and get out. We didn't have to turn around when we didn't know when we were going to be forced to leave. But that same year is when the People's Republic of China was born. As you may remember, later on that year in the summertime, Chiang Kai-shek's forces, heavily supported by the United States for 30 years almost, they left the mainland China and went over to Taiwan and established there what they call still the Republic of China. And then on October the 1st, the People's Republic of China was born. That's their 4th of July, is October the 1st, which happens to be on my 25th birthday. So Deng Xiaoping, who became the leader of China while I was president, and I negotiated all during 1978 in a very secret way, because at that time the most powerful lobby in America was the Taiwan lobby. Everybody was very deeply committed to the nationalist Chinese on Taiwan, and the communist nation on the mainland, still communist, People's Republic of China, was called Red China, and everybody condemned Red China because then communism had the same effect on the American public that terrorism has now. But I was determined, even before I was elected president, to go ahead and have normal relations with the People's Republic of China. Under the U.S. Constitution, the president is the only person who can recognize another government. The Congress has nothing to do with it. And it's a unique authority of the president. So I didn't have to consult with anybody, and I didn't. As a matter of fact, I knew how leaky this State Department was on secret, so we never sent a message between me and Deng Xiaoping from the State Department. All of them were sent directly from my office in the White House. And so we kept it completely secret, and we made the announcement on the 15th of December 1978 that we had reached agreement, and I decided that we would normalize relations beginning in January the 1st, 1979. And that's when, since then, we've had now 30 years of very good, strong diplomatic relations with a nation that's had remarkable change. At that time, there was no free enterprise at all in China. No one could earn any money for himself or herself. All the farmers had to cultivate the land under a cooperative that was controlled by the state. And it wasn't until 2 years later that Rosa and I went over to China, and we saw the first little experiments that Deng Xiaoping was doing on free enterprise. If you lived in a village or a city, you couldn't have any free enterprise still, but a few farmers in just selected places around China could have one enterprise. So you could have 5 chickens, that was the maximum, 5 hens, or you could have 5 pigs, or you could make clay pots, or you could repair bicycles or make horseshoes. But you could only do one thing, and then you could sell those horseshoes and keep the money. It was the first time in China they ever had that opportunity in 30 years. And now, of course, China is one of the greatest economic free enterprise systems on earth. They're the largest exporter of goods in the world, and they are now the 3rd largest economy on earth. They just moved ahead of Germany this month. And we have been such profligate wasters of money the last few years that we owe China now almost $1 trillion. This past December, it had reached $800 billion that we owe China. As you probably know, when the United States budget goes into deficit, we have to finance that deficit some way. And we only have 2 ways to do it. One is to print money, which would mean that we would have very high inflation. And then the other way is to sell U.S. bonds to rich countries overseas. So we have had to sell more of our bonds to China than any other country. The second creditor nation to which we owe money is Japan. So we owe them enormous sums of money now because we've been buying more from China than we have selling them. So China has changed a lot. Rosa and I went to Beijing. I met with all the Chinese leaders. Hu Jintao is the president, and also I met with the premier, who's the prime minister, and then also the vice president, a younger man who's now been anointed as the vice president and will probably be the president after Hu Jintao. So we met with them, and we had my national security advisor over there, Dr. Brzezinski, and the national security advisor for George H.W. Bush, Brent Scowcroft, and Henry Kissinger was there also, representing the administration of Richard Nixon. So it was a big celebration all over China for the 30th anniversary. We enjoyed it very much. One of the things, by the way, just to show you how things have changed, I visited Shanghai in the 1st of April, 1979. Shanghai had little narrow streets in the old city. There were no automobiles at all. In Shanghai, everybody either walked or rode bicycles or went in rickshaws. The rich people went in rickshaws. And after we had our last luncheon meeting, we rode on the fastest train on earth, which runs from downtown Shanghai out to the airport. It's a train that when engines crank up, the entire train rises up off the track 1 centimeter. It's called magnetic levitation. And then it runs, not touching anything except the air, all the way out to the airport. And it can go 310 miles an hour. And since we only had a 16-mile trip, the train couldn't get up to the maximum speed, but it got up to 268 miles an hour. That's the fastest I've ever been on the ground. But I thought about as we zoomed through through the, not the sky, but through the air, over the old city, how much China has changed in 30 years. People are very gracious, very nice, and very friendly. And I think it's probably the most important diplomatic relation in the world today, because China is dominant in the Eastern world, and we are dominant in this part of the world. And China and India kind of are in a competition, but China is much more solidly based economically than India. Of course, India has a democracy. The Carter Center has been working in China since 1980s. And one of the things we've been doing is to monitor little village elections. The Communist Party still runs the government in China, but the little villages are not part of the Communist Party, and there are 600,000 little villages. So in 1982, Deng Xiaoping ordained to the National People's Congress that little villages could have democratic elections, and in 1987 they made it mandatory. So they've asked the Carter Center to monitor those little villages having elections. They're towns about the size of Plains, or sometimes they have 2,000 or 3,000 people, but they have their own individual one. When Deng Xiaoping was over here, by the way, he asked me at a state banquet if there was anything personally he could do for me. And I said, yeah, I have one personal request. When I was a little child in Plains Baptist Church, I gave 5 cents a week to missionaries in China to build hospitals and schools for little Chinese children. And now you don't have any freedom of worship in China, and you don't permit Bibles to be distributed. And I would like for you to do that. And he said, well, I'll have to think about that. But the next morning at breakfast, he came down and said, I've decided to agree with your request. So he went back to China and changed the Constitution of China to guarantee freedom of worship. And now there are possibly more Christians in China than any other nation in the world. About half of them are registered with the government, and about the other half have so-called house congregations where they don't register with the government, but the government of China doesn't bother them. Rosa and I visited a little county not too far from Qingdao a while back with Senator Sam Nunn and his wife, and they had 24 new churches in that county which had been built up. And so it's a very good thing. A few weeks ago, we had the top representatives of the Protestant church and the Catholic church and the Muslims and the Hindus and Buddhists here in this church. They came over to see me. And so we're trying to help in every way we can with them. Probably, as you say, we had a good time with the Chinese visit. We will be leaving Monday to go up for the inauguration. I'm an honorary chairperson of the inauguration ceremonies, and thank goodness I haven't had to deal with the crowds, but all the former presidents are honorary chairpersons. So we'll be on the platform with Obama when he takes office. Rosa and I have programs in about 70 nations in the world, and we travel to those foreign countries quite often. And it's indescribable how excited people are all over the world about a black man being elected president of the United States. It's changed the image of our country, and people have maybe excessive hopes that he's going to be a miracle worker and can go into office and change things immediately, but obviously most people that think about it know that that's not possible. But he does have a great challenge and responsibility on his shoulders, and we need to remember him in our prayer. Well, we are studying now. Well, one of the things I was going to mention is Gaza. The Carter Center has had an office in Ramallah, which is in the West Bank, and we've had a small office in Gaza, and we've had an office in Jerusalem ever since we had the election in 2006, which Rosa and I and the Carter Center monitored. And Gaza is a tragic place. It's the most densely populated place on earth. In a little tiny area, they have 1.5 million Palestinians living, and it's completely surrounded by a high wall, so none of the Palestinians can get in or out. And the Israelis destroyed the airport a number of years ago, and they have the sea closed off So no Gaza citizen can go in and out at all. And the only gate that permits water or food or medicine to come in is on the Israeli side, on the northern side. And the Israelis keep that gate closed most of the time. When the Israelis occupied Gaza up until June, up until 2006, they were bringing in about 700 truckloads of supplies a day. That's how much it takes for 1.5 million people. But now, on the best days, they only bring in 100 truckloads a day, which means that they're getting just 15 or 20% of what food and clothing and medicines and water they need. And in addition to that, now surrounded by the wall, they're being bombarded. They don't have any way to fight back against bombs and missiles and shells coming in on them. And I noticed in the paper this morning that 1,100 Gazans have been killed, 450 of whom are children and women. This past week, they shelled the United Nations school, where the only people in there were 30 children. All 30 children were killed. So now maybe we'll have some peace there for a change. And I hope that one of the facets of the peace agreement will be to force the Israelis to let food and water go into these people. And they've been starving now since June of 2007. Our lesson this entire quarter will be dealing with people who are insignificant, but who became leaders in their own way. The first Sunday of this year, we studied about 2 midwives who were ordered by the Pharaoh of Egypt to do what? Anybody remember? To kill the babies when they were born to whom? To Israelite mothers. But the 2 midwives refused to do so. And when the Pharaoh's people came and questioned them about it, they said that the Israelite mothers had the babies so fast, much faster than the Egyptian mothers, that they didn't have time to kill them before they were born. Well, I don't know if God performed a miracle and had Israelite mothers have babies in a hurry, or whether the midwives were lying. I don't want to comment on that. But anyway, they were looked upon as heroes because they defied the authority, which was a Pharaoh, in order to protect the birth of the Israelite boys. And then last Sunday, I wasn't here, but we studied about a woman named Rahab. What do we know about her? Prostitute? Where? Where was she living? In Jericho? In Jericho. Jericho is now in the West Bank. It's in the Jordan River Valley, and it's a city about 10 miles from the Jordan River. Rosen have been there often because it's a very important place to vote. And when we go over to monitor elections among the Palestinians, we always go to Jericho, which is a very interesting place. But anyway, and Rahab did what? Anybody remember? She did what? She hid the spies, right. She protected the Israelite spies that were sent in by Moses to assess what the status was in Canaan, on the west side of the Jordan River, which we would now call the West Bank. And what happened with the spies? Anybody remember that? We didn't study that, but you recall? 10 spies went in, I believe, and 8 of them reported what? Bad report. They were giants there, 8 feet tall, and there was no way for the Israelites to prevail if they crossed the river, and we better stay on the east side of the Jordan River and not go in. 2 of them gave an honest report, and who were they? Joshua and Caleb. Why don't you come up and teach the lesson? All right. Joshua and Caleb. And Joshua and Caleb, by the way, were the only 2 adults that were born in Egypt that did what? They got to see the promised land, got to go into it. Moses, you know, was not permitted to go into the promised land, and all the other people died. It's hard for us to remember, or even to assess what happened with the Israelites. From the time of Joseph, who went in and became, as you know, a helper to the Pharaoh and in effect the governor of all of Egypt. And then he brought in his brothers and his father, and and they started an Israelite encampment there, and eventually grew into an enormous number of people. And the Pharaoh, when he was dealing with the midwives, said that there were more Israelites in the country than there were Egyptians. And so they started trying to get rid of them. And eventually, we know that Moses brought the people out of Egypt. But it was about 400 years between the time of Joseph and the time of Moses. And then there was 40 more years when the Israelite people wandered back and forth around the desert. And if you look at a map in comparison with the United States or with Europe, it's a very tiny little place. So they spent 40 years wandering around in this tiny little part of a desert. During that time, they had all kinds of doubts about God, and Moses protected them. And when Moses went up on the mountain to get the 10 Commandments from God, the law from God, who was one of those with him? Do you remember? Joshua was actually on the mountain with Moses. Joshua was one of the young military leaders who helped fight when Moses was leading the people out of the promised land. And Joshua was the one that held the army in battle against the Amalekites when Moses maintained God's protection by doing what? By holding up his staff. And Aaron and Ner, I don't remember who Ner was, held up Moses' arm while Joshua did the fighting. What else do we know about Joshua? That's who we're going to be studying about this morning. What was his mother's name? His mother's name was Nun. And he was what tribe? Anybody remember that? He was a tribe of Ephraim. That's about all we know about Joshua's early life, but he was obviously picked out by God at the very beginning to be a top-level assistant for Moses. Aaron, the head of a priest, was probably the number 2 person during the time they came across the desert, but Joshua was a right hand of Moses. And as they wandered through the desert for 40 years, they didn't have any reason to go into battle except that one time against the Amalekites. So you see, they arrived in what's now Jordan, across on the east bank of the Jordan River, finally, and that's when Moses died, and Joshua became his heir of all kinds of privileges or responsibilities. He was a political leader, he was a military leader, and he was also the spiritual leader of the Israelites at that time. They didn't know what was going to happen, and none of them were trained to fight in battle. And there were an incredible number of them. This is another thing that's almost impossible to imagine. The Bible in Exodus says there were 600,000 men. And if you figure that out, you can figure about one woman for every man, and just assume that each couple only had 2 children. That's 2.5 million people that were moving around somehow or another in the desert and eventually wound up in Jordan. You can imagine how many that is. 2.5 million is about as many as live in Atlanta. In fact, not quite that many live in the city limits of Atlanta. You'd have to go into the suburbs to get that many people. But that was an enormous crowd of people that wound up in Jordan looking across at the other side of the Jordan River. And that's where our lesson starts today. Let's turn now to the book of Joshua, and we'll be reading in the third chapter. Last chapter is when they were sent into the promised land as spies. It says Joshua the son of Nun sent 2 men secretly as spies. And that's when Rahab helped them out. Now let's turn now to Joshua 3, and I'll read the first 8 verses. Early in the morning, Joshua arose and set out from Shittim. That's a city on the Jordanian side of the Jordan River, with all the Israelites. And they came to the Jordan, that is the Jordan River. They camped there before crossing over. At the end of 3 days, the officers went through the camp and commanded the people, when you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God being carried by the Levitical priest, then you shall set out from your place and follow it, so that you may know the way you should go, for you have not passed this way before. Yet there shall be a space between you and it, a distance of about 2,000 cubits, which is 1,000 yards, which is as far away as 10 football fields. So in a crooked road, I don't see how they could see it. Do not come any nearer to it. Let's stop there for a moment now. The Jordan River, how many of you have seen the Jordan River? I have. The first time I saw it was in 1973. And we were amazed because the Jordan River is about as large as Muckalee Creek. It's not as large as the Kinchifuni Creek. It's small, very small. In some places it's only as wide as this center section in the church. In other places it might be as wide as two of these sections. But a very small river. And it's getting smaller and smaller every year. Does anybody know why? Because of irrigation out of the upper reaches of the Jordan River. The Jordan River starts north of the Sea of Galilee, and it originates on Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon is an enormous mountain that I was there last month. As a matter of fact, I went over to the southern part of Lebanon just to see how the international peacekeeping forces were maintaining order in southern Lebanon. And we flew right over to Mount Hermon. It's an enormous mountain. It stays snow-capped all year long, and out of the bottom of it comes a little trickle of water that gets larger and larger and runs into the Galilee. But the Israelis, since they've occupied the West Bank, have irrigated out of the Jordan River, and the Sea of Galilee is falling now in its level, far below what it used to be. I'm giving you too much modern history, I guess, but this is making it easier for an agreement to be worked concerning Israel leaving Syria's Golan Heights, because the argument is about how far west Syria goes. And if you take that Syria went to the borders of the Sea of Galilee 30 years ago, then the sea has fallen, and so there's a lot of open land there now between the previous boundary of Jordan and the present level of the sea. So the Israelis will have a room there, if they reach an agreement, to build a highway and a railroad, if they want, along that side of the Sea of Galilee to get between North and South Israel. So that's one advantage. The Dead Sea is also drying up because of increased irrigation use out of the Jordan River that runs into the Dead Sea. And within a number of years, there'll be two Dead Seas because the level's going down so rapidly. So it's changing very much. And I would say one of the long-term arguments between the people of Israel and the people of Jordan and Syria are going to be about the water supplies. So this is what's happened here with the Jordan River. And you see that then Joshua said to the people, the 5th verse, then Joshua told the people, sanctify yourselves. That means cleanse yourselves in a religious way. They wash themselves, they change their clothes, they wash their clothes, and so forth in order to sanctify themselves. For tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. By the way, what was the Ark of the Covenant? Anybody know? It was what? It was a box of Tin. It was a big chest, it had poles through it so they wouldn't have to touch it. And inside was a broken 10 Commandments, broken stones. And what else was there in there? Manna, a jar of manna to show that God had fed the people when they were starving. And one other thing. Aaron's rod, very good. Aaron's rod, those were the 3 things in the Ark of the Covenant. And when the Israelites camped, it was okay for them to get fairly close to the Ark of the Covenant. They would the priest would set the Ark of the Covenant down, say, in a campsite, and the people could walk around it. If they couldn't touch it, but they could come around it and look at it. But when it was used as a symbol of God's presence, like now when they are going to form a line and march to the Jordan River, they wanted them to stay 1,000 yards away from it. that was a very, very interesting thing, I thought. Does anybody remember who Uzzah was? Who was Uzzah? I see you know it. He was one that touched the ark. You may remember that when David moved the capital into Jerusalem, which in early times was known as Jebus, Jabus. David changed the name to Jerusalem. He was going to bring the Ark of the Covenant in there from where it had been in tents and so forth for a long time. And they were walking down the road, and the oxen went into a hole, and the Ark of the Covenant almost tilted over, and Uzzah, who thought he was doing right, put his hand up and touched the Ark of the Covenant. And what happened to him? He was executed by God. And David got very angry about that. So the Ark of the Covenant was treated as a presence of God, although we know that God's presence is omniscient. It's everywhere, omnipresent. Let's read on down. 6th verse now, 3rd chapter. To the priest Joshua said, "Take up the Ark of the Covenant and pass on in front of the people." So they took up the Ark of the Covenant and went on in front of the people. In the 7th verse, the Lord said to Joshua, "This day I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, so that they may know that I will be with you as I was with Moses. You are the one who shall command the priests who bear the Ark of the Covenant. When you come to the edge of the waters of the Jordan, you shall stand still in the Jordan." I think there's a division there. We'll go ahead and read the rest of it. In the 9th verse, Joshua then said to the Israelites, "Draw near and hear the words of the Lord your God." Joshua said, "By this you shall know that among you is a living God, who without fall will drive out from before you the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgasites, Amorites, and Jebusites. The Ark of the Covenant of the Lord of all the earth is going to pass before you into the Jordan River. So now select 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one from each tribe." By the way, in the next few chapters in the book of Joshua, these 12 men were instructed, each one of them, to pick up a stone and to carry the stone across the Jordan River to the far side, which was a place called Gilgal. And when Joshua got over there, he took the 12 stones and made an altar in honor of God. When the soles of the feet of the priests who bear the ark of the Lord, the God of the Lord of all the earth, rest in the waters of the waters of the Jordan flowing from above shall be cut off. They shall stand in a single heap. That ends the text for today. Well, I think all of us can envision here what is happening. This is a momentous event in the lives of the Israelites, who had been in persecution now for 430 years, since the time of Joseph. First they were kind of honored, then they were looked upon as taken as slaves, then they were persecuted, then they finally escaped. And this is a very parallel situation till we know what happened when they got to the Red Sea with Moses, when the waters parted and let them go through. So the miraculous power of God was demonstrated to these people very vividly. And then they were going to cross over. By the way, that ends our lesson. I'm going to get back to it in a minute. But what happens in the future as the Israelites pour into the West Bank, and what's now the West Bank and Israel, what happened in the future? Anybody remember? What happened for the next 400 years? Nobody has any idea? It was a time of whom? Of the judges. And the judges. And God would ordain through human means the choice of leaders for the Israelite people who lived in the Canaan land then. And there were different prophets that existed, and different heroes came up. One of the heroes we're going to study about next Sunday, his name is Samson. And he's one of those that's ordained. to go forward and to represent God in beneficial ways until he finally reaches his problems with his woman companion. We'll study that next Sunday. I won't get into that. But this is a time that we need to kind of look at the whole gamut of it. So for 400 years, the judges represented God's voice among the Israelite people. And then what happened? They demanded a king because they saw that the other people that lived in the Holy Land, the Ammonites and others, Jebusites and all, I can't remember all the names, Hittites, they had kings, and quite often in battle, the king would look very pompous, sitting on a horse or something like that, and leading the troops, and they wanted a king of their own. So eventually, God permitted them to have a king. Who was that? Saul. And Saul started out as a very good king. In fact, the Bible describes him as an extraordinary person. He was a head taller than anybody else, for instance, among the Israelites. And at first he was very good, but he later got selfish and jealous, particularly jealous of David, who was a shepherd boy and was anointed to be the future king. And we might look at the times here. When Abraham came to the Holy Land at first, that was roughly 2,000 years before the birth of Christ. And then when the Israelites were in captivity as slaves in Egypt, and Moses brought them out, that was roughly, Moses brought them out roughly 1,400 years before Christ. And now they've crossed over into the Jordan about that time. And then for 400 years, the judges ruled, and then King David ruled about 1,000 years before Christ. And the Israelite people, after David and Solomon ruled, became very sinful and turned away from God. And both the northern tribes, the 10 tribes in the north and the 2 tribes in the south, both were taken into captivity, and so they lived in exile for quite a while. And that's when most of the prophets gave their prediction of the future and called on the Israelites to turn back to God. And that lasted for about 500 years. And then between the final prophets that we know about and the birth of Christ is a gap in biblical history between the Old Testament and the New Testament, roughly 400 or 500 years. And then, of course, we start all over again with the birth of Christ in the New Testament. So that kind of gives you a very quick chronology of what happened. What did we get out of this lesson today? What lessons did we get? I think in every one of our lessons from the Old Testament and New Testament, we should search for and find some application of this lesson to our own personal lives. So as we study about Joshua, and I'll also throw in Rahab and the 2 midwives, what lesson do we get out of these stories for ourselves?
God can use anybody.
God can use anybody. That's right. And we never know who that will be. My own life was changed when a very close parallel to Joshua and Moses occurred. I was in the U.S. Naval Academy studying to be a naval officer and later became a submarine officer when Franklin D. Roosevelt died. And I literally wept because I was so distressed that a non-entity would become my commander-in-chief, a person in whom I had no confidence and knew nothing about, and that was Harry S. Truman. And there was a broad feeling of despair in the United States, not only because of the tragedy of Roosevelt's death, but because we had then inherited a president in whom we had no confidence and about whom we had no knowledge. And Roosevelt treated Truman as though he was not very important. The most important scientific development in my lifetime occurred during Roosevelt's time, and what was that? Development of atomic power for destructive uses. When Roosevelt died, although he had done all the work in so-called Manhattan Project, he had never told Truman about it. Truman didn't know anything about the atomic power or that you could make explosives when he became president of the United States. He got no briefings at all from that. But as a matter of fact, when I've been asked for the last 30 years or more, my favorite president during my lifetime, guess who it is? Harry S. Truman. I think he came from being kind of a county official. As you know, in Independence, Missouri, he was very proud of the fact that he was on the county commission. And if you look at his tombstone, you'll see that he doesn't exalt himself. He refers to his local service. But he was a great man. I don't think Harry Truman ever told a lie in his life. I think if he used a 3-cent stamp while he was in the White House, he would probably pay for it himself. He was meticulously honest and very courageous. And Harry Truman was the one who broke the ice in ending racial segregation in the United States of America. Long before Rosa Parks ever sat in the front of a bus, or before anybody knew who Martin Luther King Jr. was, Harry Truman, through the power of his office as Commander-in-Chief, with the stroke of a pen over the opposition of the entire Congress, said there will be no more racial segregation in the military forces. So in the Coast Guard, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines, and the Army, all racial segregation was ended. And that affected me, because by that time I was on a submarine, and we had discrimination in the Navy. The cooks and servants were black people and Filipinos, and then all of a sudden they were equal to all the rest of us. This is very difficult for America to take, but it shows the insight that Harry Truman had. So this is just an indication of how you can inherit an office like Joshua did for Moses, and the inheritor, like Harry Truman and Joshua, became equal to the task because they turned to God and they let God be their guide. So I would say that 3 lessons we can learn this morning is that we should put our faith in God and entirely. No matter what challenge we face, no matter what opportunity we might have, we should put our faith in God. Secondly, we should be prepared to serve God and avoid underestimating our own influence, because we never know when one small action that we take might affect someone else who could later become a Joshua or a Harry Truman or a great spiritual leader. So even though we have a tendency to not have enough faith in ourselves. And I would say the final thing is we should never underestimate our role in God's service. And depend on the perfect example of Jesus Christ as a guide to the way we should act. So those 3 things, I think in every case we ought to put ourselves in the role of deciding, even though we have to search ourselves, what lesson can I get from this particular Bible text? So as you look at 2 unknown midwives, a relatively unknown prostitute or harlot, and a young man who came out of a desert as just a lieutenant in the army at first, but became the successor of Moses, or a guy like Harry Truman who became president of the United States and relatively unknown before he assumed authority. We should put ourselves in the same position as they were, to search in every possible way to serve God through our faith in Jesus Christ, and based on our total confidence that if we do that, then we'll have a partner that is unexcelled, a partner that knows everything and has all power as we put ourselves hand in hand with God Almighty. Let's bow our heads for a closing prayer. Well, Father, as we study this morning about Joshua, help us to apply the lesson we've learned to our own lives. Let us realize that although we might be tending to underestimate ourselves, God looks upon us with our talent, our ability, our opportunities, our surroundings, our environment, to serve as best we can, because we never know the influence that we might have on others, and also set an example among those who are intimate with us, our own friends and family, to exalt ourselves collectively in the service of Jesus Christ. In His name we pray. Amen. Thank you very much. And I'm going to ask somebody to get the clock fixed, because the clock is wrong. Thank you all very much. I'll be back in a few minutes.
We hope you have found the preceding message to be both enjoyable and meaningful in your spiritual life. If you visited in person, it is our prayer that you felt a warm welcome and the presence of God. If you've not yet visited us, you would certainly be welcome at any time which may be convenient for you. We will gladly provide information as to which Sundays President Carter will be here to teach. Our mailing address, as shown on the screen, is Post Office Box 307, Plains, Georgia 31780. You may telephone us at 229-824-7896. We also have a website where you can find the latest teaching schedule and the answers to many of your possible questions. The web address is shown on your screen. The lesson materials are based on the Uniform Bible Study Series as published and copyrighted by Smith & Hellis Publishing Incorporated of Macon, Georgia, and are used with their permission. If you would like additional information about this lesson, you may write them at Smith & Hellis, 6316 Peak Road, Macon, Georgia, 31210, or you may telephone at 800-568-1248. May God truly bless you and all of your loved ones.